In Colombia, at the dawn of the mass cocaine smuggling era, there were two major organizations, the Medellin Cartel and the Cali Cartel. Only a social outcast has not heard of the former, due to the fame of its leader, Pablo Escobar. However, Cali can be considered even more successful than the former. Comparing these cartels, almost everyone comes to the conclusion that Cali was a corporation with a clear mechanism, and Medellin was more like a collection of bargainers who often acted rashly and impulsively. Yes, Medellin was the leader of the cocaine market for a long time because it was the first to occupy this niche. But Cali, slowly and methodically using Medellin's mistakes, was able to destroy this cartel and then surpass it, expanding its zone of influence almost all over the world. So if you're interested in hearing about Colombia's most powerful drug organization, then meet the Cali Cartel on the other side of the law. Before you continue watching, I'd like to ask for your financial support of the channel. At the link in the description, you can find my store-branded merch with exclusive prints designed by me. If you have the opportunity and you like something, please buy it so you can help the channel to develop. Thank you in advance and enjoy your viewing. The progenitor of the Cali cocaine trade was Benjamin Herrera Zuleta, nicknamed the Black Pope of Cocaine. He was a real drug veteran, convicted in 1974 for coke trafficking in Atlanta, Georgia, from which he soon escaped and settled in Cali. There, he formed a distribution network for coca paste, which he imported into Colombia for processing and shipping to the United States. He was arrested in Cali in June 1975 with a huge shipment of cocaine for those times, but was released the following March. Herrera first hung out in Antioquia, and then he hid for a long time in the south of the continent, hiding from extradition. Those who took Herrera's place in Cali were Rodriguez Orejuela brothers Gilberto Jose, aka the chess player, and Miguel Angel, and their buddy Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, aka Chepe, who were members of a gang called Los Chemas. They came to the attention of law enforcement in the early 1970s. The early history of the Cali Cartel and the biographies of its main founders, Gilberto and Miguel Rodriguez and Jose Santa Cruz Londoño, are shrouded in mystery, and accounts of their childhood and family backgrounds are conflicting and filled with mutually exclusive details. The only thing that's certain is that the Rodriguez brothers were natives of Mariquita in the department of Tolima and grew up in the poor barrio of Balthazar in Cali. Gilberto was born in 1939 and Miguel in 1943. The older one apparently never finished high school, but Miguel claimed to have graduated from law school, though many witnesses later confirmed Miguel bought his diploma by donating a library to the university and lavishing the dean with gifts. In a 1991 Time article, Gilberto detailed his family and childhood. "I was born between the towns of Mariquita and Honda, Tolima. My father was a painter and draftsman, and my mother was a housewife. We were 3 brothers and 3 sisters. When I was 15, I started working as a clerk in a pharmacy in Cali. By my 20s, I was a manager, and at 25, 10 years after I started in the business, I quit to start my own pharmacy business." He wasn't lying about working in a pharmacy. From it, he and his brother supplied legal narcotics, and 10 years later, Gilberto actually opened the La Rebaja chain of pharmacies. Meanwhile, from their early youth, the brothers established their street credibility, gaining respect from other similar gangs on the streets of Cali. Santa Cruz Londoño had known the Rodriguez brothers since he was a child. He was born in 1943 and attended the same school as them. By 1969, they had joined Los Chemas, which was led by experienced criminal Luis Fernando Tamayo Garcia. Los Chemas was involved in at least several kidnappings of foreign nationals and wealthy businessmen. In these kidnappings, the Rodriguez brothers were assigned the role of simple actors, but Chepe was listed as one of the ringleaders. There was also information that the names of the future Cali Cartel jefes appeared in the criminal proceedings for counterfeiting dollars, but none of them ever reached the court, as the judge received threats, and Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela at the beginning of his career moonlighted as a bomber under the pseudonym The Chess Player. The brothers started their drug business like everyone else, with marijuana, but when cocaine, which was easier to transport, loomed on the horizon, they switched to it. So, by 1975, the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers began personally transporting small amounts of coca paste from Peru to their native Cauca Valley. With the profits from the kidnappings, they scraped together the money to buy a small airplane. The plane carried more paste, which they purified in laboratories in the banks of the Nariño and Cauca rivers. In the same year of 1975, they were already mentioned in authorities' reports as drug traffickers. It's also known for sure that in the mid-70s, it was from the organization in Cali that Hernando Gerardo Soto, a childhood friend of the Rodriguez brothers, and Chepe Santa Cruz went to the United States with the sole purpose of establishing solid contacts for distribution. A little later, the famous Medellin Ochoa clan, whose patriarch incidentally grew up in Cali and was personally acquainted with the founders of the cartel, would do the same. Each of the founders of the Cali Cartel had their own style, which helped them develop the criminal organization. Gilberto, a short, chubby guy, looked harmless enough, but became known as the chess player for his ruthless and calculating approach to the drug business. The chess player was initially supposed to be the hands-on manager of the cartel, but eventually became responsible for the organization's strategic planning. Handsome Miguel, the younger brother, was a micromanager who liked to get involved in the minute details of the cartel's day-to-day operations and, by all accounts, was quite the evil boss. People who worked for the Cali Cartel looked at Gilberto as a kind uncle, recalled Ruben Prieto, a DEA agent. Everybody loved him. On the other hand, everyone was scared to death of Miguel. Jorge Salcedo, one of the key characters in the story, recalled that there were days when it was best not to go into Miguel's office, and everyone was warned when he was in a bad mood. Jose Santa Cruz Londoño was stocky, rugged in appearance, and coarse in emotion. He was known as Chepe to his associates and was the most brutal of the three founders. Chepe became the permanent coordinator of the Cali Cartel's international cocaine transportation network. Elmer Pacho Herrera joined the cartel later than any of the others. Santa Cruz and the Rodriguez brothers came to terms with his homosexuality. It was very strange, recalled one DEA agent. From the stories I heard, they tolerated Pacho. They giggled among themselves about his homosexual behavior. But Pacho would go off and do his thing, and business was business. Herrera was born in 1951 and was the youngest of the Cali bosses. There's talk that he was the son of the Black Pope of cocaine, Benjamin Herrera Zuleta, but Pacho himself has never made any comment on this. Pacho received a technical degree and went to New York on a professional visa, where he saved up money and ran a semi-legal jewelry business for a while. But in the mid-70s, he got involved in the cocaine trade and was arrested twice, in 1975 and 78. Pacho Herrera returned to Cali in 1983 after a short prison stint and negotiated a supply and distribution rights agreement with Cali's founders that allowed him to consolidate and expand his own base in New York. He later became a member of the cartel's board of directors and proved to be an invaluable collaborator, using his connections and acquaintances to help Cali reach Mexican partners through Juan Matapalasteros. Of all the directors of the Cali Cartel, the least information is known about him. He's never positioned himself as an honest businessman or caught himself in the press. Throughout the 70s, the Cali Cartel strengthened and refined its network, improved organization and logistics, and began to use its family and criminal contacts, as well as the Colombian immigrant community in the United States, to promote itself. At this stage, differences in the path chosen by their Medellin competitors can already be traced. The Medellin Cartel, at the same time, used unjustified violence to destroy their rivals and carve out a niche for themselves in Miami and South Florida. Meanwhile, the Cali Cartel was quietly and peacefully going about its business, creating a market for cocaine in New York City. It took years for law enforcement from New York City to detect the cartel's presence. To give you an example, between March and October 1978 alone, the Cali Cartel peddled $26 million worth of powder under the noses of agents. Within 3 years, Geraldo Soto, sent to represent the cartel in New York, had formed an important cocaine distribution network that expanded at an incredible rate until it was discovered by the Syntac 4 task force created to prosecute his organization. Soto was then replaced by Santa Cruz Londoño, and work continued. At this time, Gilberto Rodriguez, along with Jorge Luis Ochoa, owned a bank in Panama, where they sent much of the profits made in the United States. From there, the money went to subsidiaries of Colombian banks in Panama. And about 30 shell companies laundered the money until all the coke stains were wiped off. This stage was not without complications. In the late 70s, Japanese Ishiro Kawai was arrested in New York, the owner of jewelry stores of the same name in Colombia. Kawai was found in possession of a briefcase with almost $3 million in cash. Kawai was involved in laundering money for the cartel through his gemstone business and quickly began to testify. The Japanese man apparently leaked what little information he knew, and a few days later, an Alabama farm purchased by Rodriguez Orejuela was raided, and a runway for small planes carrying cocaine was found. Also on Kawai's trip, agents checked out a wooden door factory that was bringing in wood for production from Colombia. The importer was listed as Atlantic Lumber Co., which rented a warehouse in Baltimore, Maryland. Each board in the shipment was just over 3 meters long and 10 centimeters thick. Inside were found swirls of 2.25 kilograms of cocaine each. Atlantic Lumber was registered in the name of Jorge Suarez and Miguel Barbosa, who turned out to be Santa Cruz Londoño and Jose Patino, then considered the largest cocaine distributors in New York. This then led to a suspicious Colombian, Daniel Ocampo, who was placed under surveillance. Santa Cruz Londoño, who was already being followed by the DEA, had meanwhile returned to Cali, while Gilberto Rodriguez had gone to the United States to oversee the distribution network and did not yet know that Ocampo was under watch. Miguel stayed in his homeland and by then was doing extensive work to infiltrate the country's upper social strata. He had an unbeatable ally, journalist Alberto Giraldo, who was the best public relations expert among private company representatives and high-ranking government officials. But Gilberto did not stay long in the United States. In January 1980, Daniel Ocampo's phone was intercepted, and by the end of the month, it was discovered that he was making frequent calls to the Waldorf Astoria Hotel in New York to the room of Fernando Gutierrez. Ocampo was arrested in late January 1980 with $300,000 in cash. Documents found on him led them to conclude that his cocaine transactions totaled $2 million a month, and he was one of the Cali Cartel's big dealers. They also unmasked 2 other Colombians involved in the organization, Luis Ibargüen and Manuel Vasquez. The day Ocampo was captured, the enigmatic Fernando Gutierrez checked out of the hotel, but he made a serious mistake. He registered his address in Florida, No. 1 Grove Island Building. The Grove Island Building administrator identified Jose Santa Cruz from a photograph as Fernando Gutierrez's regular visitor, and Gutierrez turned out to be none other than Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela. It was February 1980, and it was at this time that agents were finally able to identify all of the Cali Cartel bosses by face and name. Gilberto Rodriguez realized that he was in serious trouble and decided to move his operations to a quieter location. He ordered his subordinate, Jaime Munera, to buy a cattle ranch in Hope Hole, Alabama for $800,000. Munera built an airstrip there, but inadvertently exposed himself by doing something stupid. He bought 200 head of cattle with cash and at a price far above the market value of the herd. So authorities seized the ranch in September 1981, accusing Munera of buying the property with drug money. Thus, the DEA was able to seize $2 million in cash, 70 weapons, and over 200 kilos of cocaine, with a street value of $50 million from the Cali Cartel in the 3 years from 1978 to 1981. Law enforcement officials identified about 40 members of the organization, and prosecutors convicted many of them on cocaine trafficking charges and identified the bosses. And after another 3 years, it was clear to them, none of this had affected the Cali Cartel's operations. Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela returned to his hometown, and Jose Chepe Santa Cruz was still a key man in the United States and continued to work to make New York City a major cocaine beachhead. Chepe's right hand, Cervantes, later detailed how cocaine was distributed in New York City. In the early 80s, it was being shipped from Miami to New York. He had to be ready for Santa Cruz's call at any time. More often than not, the product was transported in decent cars in well-disguised secret compartments. Upon arrival at the destination point, Cervantes would call the pager number given by the boss and go to the hotel to wait for a courier to pick up the shipment. The courier would arrive, take the car keys, and return an hour later with an empty car. Back in Miami, Cervantes would wait for the next phone call and instructions for another trip to the Big Apple. Between 1980 and 83, Cervantes traveled to New York about 100 times, with 30 to 35 kilos of cocaine on each trip. The street value at the time was about $30,000 per kilo, so the amount of white Cervantes transported during this period was estimated to be at least $90 million. At first, Chepe stored the product, money, and weapons in stash houses in densely populated Latino neighborhoods such as Washington Heights or the Lower East Side of Manhattan. These were high crime areas. However, the local hoodlums often killed his employees and stole money and drugs. So, as the organization grew, Chepe began setting up stash houses in middle-class neighborhoods, first in Queens and Manhattan, and then in Westchester and further out Long Island, where there was much less chance of being robbed. Further afield, Chepe bought real estate companies with access to large number of properties in New York City, especially in the Queens area. One such company, Mechizo Realty, even supplied Chepe's organization with mobile phones and false documents. The realtors had permanent residency status and spoke perfect English. No one suspected they were involved in a criminal enterprise. They made rental applications, signed them, and paid bills in fictitious names. It was like the Cali Cartel was renting out apartments to themselves. The real estate companies were part of a vast support network of corrupt business and government sources that the Cali Cartel painstakingly built up in the Big Apple in the late 70s and early 80s. Its payroll, for example, included car dealers who took cash without asking questions and bureaucrats from the Department of Motor Vehicles who supplied fake badges and ID cards. All transactions were meticulously recorded in ledgers. Based on an analysis of the Santa Cruz Group's financial records, police concluded that it was receiving about $4 million weekly. Bosses thoroughly vetted all candidates before hiring them for dealer vacancies. Getting a place in the cartel was not easy. One applicant recounted how it happened. First, he was interviewed by a representative of the organization in Cali via a payphone. Next, he was faxed a list of rules, a corporate contract, so to speak. Live modestly and avoid drawing attention to yourself were the two main stipulations. Even people who owned stash houses had to leave the house in the morning and return at night, like any typical working-class person. After the applicant read the list, they were ordered to cut it into small pieces and throw it away. Couriers and dealers were required to be on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was a system of numbered telephone booths for this purpose. The courier, upon arriving in New York with a shipment, would page Chepe the booth's number, or he would be told where to go, and the boss would call back after a while to discuss business. Chepe required employees to carry $100 worth of quarters at all times, so they would have no problem calling from the booths. When Santa Cruz gave his men a phone number, they were required to write another number on that piece of paper, so that if someone on the outside tried to memorize the numbers, they would memorize the wrong ones. The Cali Cartel implemented the same system for its three other major markets, Miami, Houston, and Los Angeles, establishing a rigid cellular structure. The guiding philosophy of the emerging Cali Cartel was that the less its members knew, the better for the organization. Each employee was assigned a code number, a record of which was kept at headquarters in Cali. The cell manager would give the go-ahead to the dealer, who would go to a payphone to get a list of customers and a time to meet each one. He would then contact customers at specific locations that changed each week. The dealer usually delivered 2 kilograms to each customer, but the customer did not have to pay at the time of receipt. The cartel sold on consignment basis, meaning that 2 or 3 kilograms were distributed to the buyer on credit, and he had a certain period of time to pay. They made deliveries on Saturdays and Sundays because they believed that most police officers were off duty on those days. After paying for the goods, the dealer would return to the stash house, where using money counting machines, he would reconcile the debit and credit and report the amount received to the supervisor through a phone booth. One way to smuggle money into Colombia was by exporting automobiles, household goods, building materials, and large machinery. Smuggling money was riskier than, say, buying a $250,000 car and shipping it to Colombia. Nevertheless, money was also being smuggled out. The cartel used couriers to smuggle money out of the U.S. They carried the money in square briefcases, like those used by pilots. In the late 1970s, the cartel had its couriers fly Braniff Airways because they had contacts there. The money they smuggled in per trip ranged from $100,000 to $300,000, depending on the size of the bills. However, in the early 80s, most of the dirty money was smuggled from the U.S. to Panama, where Gilberto Rodriguez was a co-owner of a bank. Naturally, in order for an illegal business with such revenues to function and have something to launder, you need a force block. So Santa Cruz had a group of assassins known as Palestinians. They were Colombians who came from Medellin under the leadership of Julio Palestine. The Cali Cartel transported them to the United States, and they were suspected of being involved in numerous murders in New York, Chicago, and Miami. The Palestinians were known for their toughness and were elusive, diverting the law's attention away from the cartel for many years. Thus, by the early 80s, the Cali Cartel had become full-fledged and the second largest player in the growing drug market. They had a powerful organization, well-established logistics, and a skillful scheme that allowed them to lead the kind of life they dreamed of, the life of a respectable gentleman. The two cartels, Cali and Medellin, had sharply opposing views on criminal activity, but initially, between the late 1970s and early 1980s, they got along quite peacefully. Cali and Medellin actively cooperated in coordinating supplies, invested in processing labs, and amicably corrupted politicians. In fact, at that point, they were friendly competitors. Each organization had its own market, and until the mid-80s, there was plenty of room for everyone. During this period, the leaders of the Cali and Medellin cartels enjoyed their growing wealth while moving freely in society. For example, both Pablo Escobar and the Rodriguez brothers were involved in auto racing. Escobar and his partner owned a race team, and the Rodriguez brothers owned 2 racetracks. All of the bosses also shared a love of football. The Rodriguez brothers bought the Medellin-Cali team and strived to win at the national level. In addition, they, unlike Pablo, did not bury assets but put them into circulation, so successfully that the city of Cali under their leadership turned into a prosperous modern metropolis. They owned a chain of drugstores as well as pharmaceutical and cosmetic manufacturing, real estate, construction, agricultural, and distribution companies. In the 1980s, Cali had a population of over 1 million people. Naturally, there were a lot of telephones in the city, each of which was under the control of the cartel. Thanks to bribes, cartel technicians and engineers could listen to any calls. The cartel also employed thousands of cab drivers. Gathering at the airport, they reported the arrival of every suspicious gringo. The Godfathers divided Cali into fiefdoms. Gilberto and Miguel controlled downtown Cali, the area around the Intercontinental Hotel, and Ciudad Jardín in the southernmost part of Cali. Chepe owned the southern region of the city. Pacho's territories included Palmira and Yumbo, north of Cali, and Hamundi, a city 50 miles south of Cali. They each had luxurious properties in each area, protected from prying eyes by high walls. Near the dwellings were swimming pools, tennis courts, bowling alleys, cockfighting arenas, stables, dance clubs, private beaches, and football fields. To keep a low profile, they drove modest Mazdas, and the luxury cars they owned were leased to politicians and celebrities. To control the local population, the cartel bribed key figures in politics, law enforcement, and business. Gilberto's bank gave stakes to local leaders, some of whom ended up on the bank's board of directors, which entitled them to favorable loans and overdrafts. The Cali Cartel had money and power by the mid-80s, but they also wanted status, so they began working hard to get the powerful people of Cali to accept them as their own. Chepe, for example, threw lavish parties for Colombian government officials that provided food and amenities for 600 to 700 people. Yet, like Pablo Escobar, they didn't succeed at first. But again, the difference in approach can be clearly seen. Club Colombia, an exclusive social club for business people and industrialists, rejected Chepe's application for membership. The enraged drug lord didn't go killing rich snobs like his neighbors. Instead, he built an exact replica of the club on a hillside in the upscale Ciudad Jardín neighborhood and named it Casa 90. Chepe also built his own country club outside the city, Villa Brenda, to which only the powerful were allowed. In the media, the cartel bosses created an image of successful and respectable businessmen, and if there was any negative press, Gilberto personally called the journalists. Such growing influence could not fail to attract the attention of local opportunists. In November 1981, there was a meeting of leaders from both cartels about the kidnapping of Marta Ochoa by leftist guerrilla group M19 to obtain a ransom of $15 million. Historians disagree on where the crucial meeting took place, Cali or Medellin, and how many drug traffickers were present. Figures range from 20 to 223. But what is certain is that the bosses at the meeting adopted a strategy that not only freed Marta Ochoa, but also dealt with the guerrilla threat. Flyers were dropped on a football field in Cali, announcing the birth of a new organization, Muerte a Secuestradores, meaning death to traitors, or MAS, and informing them that they would see to it that everyone involved in the kidnapping was hung from a tree. The guerrillas got the message and released Marta unharmed, although it's still unclear whether any ransom was paid. At the second MAS meeting, the cartels made agreements on how cocaine shipments would be regulated and coordinated to increase their profits and which group would control which market. The Cali Cartel owned New York, the Medellin Cartel, Miami, and South Florida. California was declared a free zone, but eventually came under the control of Cali. Ochoa and Escobar dominated the two MAS meetings, and it seems that at this point, the Cali Cartel was willing to submit to Medellin's leadership. The relationship between Jorge Ochoa and Gilberto Rodriguez in the early 1980s perfectly illustrates the coexistence of the groups. Jorge Ochoa grew up in Cali and was a childhood friend of the elder Rodriguez. In the late 1970s, Jorge and Gilberto became business partners and started their own bank, First Inter-America's Bank, to launder their money. Interest on deposits tacitly remained in Panama and settled in the pockets of local General Noriega and his henchmen. In addition, at the time, both the Medellin Paisas and Cali made their most important strategic alliance with Mexico. The Cali Cartel's best friend was Amado Carrillo Fuentes, nicknamed the Lord of the Skies. He was called so because he was the one who first began using old passenger planes to transport multi-ton shipments of cocaine from Colombia to Mexico. Amado took over the Juarez cartel in 1985. Juarez is an important border point for traffic traveling through Mexico. Amado played an important role as a liaison between the Mexican Drug Confederation and the Cali Cartel. As one analyst told Time magazine, he had a real talent for building alliances. In the 90s, when Carrillo Fuentes was arguably the most powerful boss in Mexico, he developed a close working relationship with Miguel Rodriguez, the most powerful Colombian boss. The two reportedly called almost every day to discuss business. Rodriguez paid Carrillo Fuentes a transportation fee of 1 kilogram for every 2 kilos of Colombian cocaine successfully delivered to the United States. Despite their good relations and mutual respect, the two bosses constantly bickered over money, mainly because Amado frequently missed payments for the drug. Then there was a seizure, then a boat got caught in a storm and sank, or something else. Once, Carrillo Fuentes even had to send 3 Mexican hostages to Miguel as a guarantee of payment. The Mexicans were released after Carrillo Fuentes paid Rodriguez Orejuela in excess and gave him an estate in Mexico as compensation. By the mid-1980s, the U.S. cocaine market, due to the concerted actions of the two cartels and the use of Mexican distribution routes, was beginning to saturate. The price of powder in the United States fell by nearly 2/3, while in Europe, cocaine was selling for 4 times the price. In 1984, Gilberto Rodriguez and Jorge Ochoa traveled together to Spain to escape the pressure the Colombian government was putting on the country's drug traffickers and to explore the European coke market. And Europe's drug market was ripe for entering. When Gilberto Rodriguez and Jorge Ochoa moved to Spain in 1984, they bought a large ranch in Badajoz near the Portuguese border that served as an operational base from which they could analyze the potential for cocaine trafficking across Europe. The Cali Cartel contacted tobacco smugglers from Galicia in Spain, who had a known knowledge of the region's coastline and the storage facilities that could be used to smuggle drugs. The cartel began using boats to collect drugs from the ocean-going vessels and bring them ashore. To launder their money, they set up a network of accounts between Spanish and Panamanian banks and invested in real estate. By the way, if you want a separate video about the smugglers from Galicia, let me know in the comments. Jorge Ochoa sent one of his key aides, Teodoro Castrillon, to England, Germany, and Holland to make contacts with local Colombian communities and see if they could set up infrastructure and distribution networks similar to those they had in the United States. However, Gilberto, Jorge, and their wives were arrested outside Rodriguez's apartment in Madrid. The U.S. sent a lawyer to Madrid to seek Rodriguez and Ochoa's extradition, but instead, a Spanish court sent them to Colombia. Within 4 years of Rodriguez and Ochoa's arrival in Spain, the Cali Cartel had made significant gains in a drug market long dominated by heroin. Cocaine busts had skyrocketed from 900 kilos in 1985 to 13 tons by 1990. 3 years later, the cartel had so refined the European smuggling network that it used major European trading ports, including Hamburg, Liverpool, Genoa, and Rotterdam. The Cali gentlemen developed a particularly warm relationship with Italian organized crime. Cali supplied the cocaine and the Italians did the selling. They cooperated with everyone, both Sicilians and Neapolitans. The Camorra, which had the most developed heroin distribution network and the most open and corrupt port in Naples, handled large wholesale volumes of the Colombian product throughout Europe. The Camorra's services to the Cali Cartel also included money laundering. Italian authorities once discovered that the Camorra laundered $40 million for the Cali Cartel by first depositing the money into the account of someone's grandmother in Mantua. And then the grandmother transferred the funds to a dummy corporation account in New York. From there, the money was transferred to another company's account in Brazil and lost thereafter. Several arrests during cocaine sales have documented the Cali Cartel's promising relationships with Sicilians as well. For example, in 1989, the dismantling of 2 laboratories in Italy led to the seizure of 267 kilos of cocaine base and cocaine hydrochloride. And in the same year, an FBI informant confessed to arranging the transportation of over 500 kilograms of powder from Colombia to Sicily. By 1992, 2 important events dramatically increased the Cali Cartel's potential for expansion in Europe. The first was the collapse of communism following the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the dissolution of the Soviet Union on January 1, 1993. The second was the emergence of a borderless Europe after European trade barriers were erased in 1992 under the provisions of the 1987 Single European Act. Immediately after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the first organizations to emerge between East and West were crime syndicates. The Cali Cartel and major European criminal groups began holding summit meetings in the early 1990s to see how they could better cooperate to advance their illegal interests. It took some time for the cooperation to bear fruit. In the first 3 months of 1993, some 2,300 kilograms of cocaine were seized, and the importance of Eastern European countries and Russia in the global transit of drugs began to grow. Evidence of their growing importance was evidenced by the amount of coke seized in the region. For example, on February 21, 1993, about 1,092 kilos of dope were seized near St. Petersburg, Russia, and several people were arrested. In September and October 1991, authorities in Czechoslovakia and Poland seized 2 100-kilogram cocaine shipments hidden in batches of beer. The level of criminal cooperation seemed to have no geographical limits. European traffickers even traveled to Colombia to exchange experiences and establish strong partnerships. There's evidence that Colombians attempted to enter the Japanese market, but were unable to reach an agreement with the Yakuza. By early 1993, nearly a decade after Gilberto Rodriguez and Jorge Ochoa's trip to Spain, the Cali Cartel had a global reach that was perhaps unparalleled in the history of organized crime. And the potential for growth could have been endless had the war of all against all initiated by the Medellin Cartel not been sparked in Colombia. The Medellin Cartel had become the primary target of U.S. law enforcement efforts. Alexander F. Watson, deputy chief at the U.S. Embassy in Bogota from 1981 to 84, said the mission viewed Cali as a relatively quiet city during that period. The drug trade was just beginning to boom, Watson recalled. Back then, if you were an American, you could travel to Cali from Bogota at any time without fear of anything. The U.S. government maintained a favorable attitude toward Cali drug traffickers throughout the 80s. Explaining why the U.S. paid little attention to Cali, Crescencio Arcos Jr., a diplomat and deputy assistant to the U.S. Secretary of State in the 1980s, said, "We thought of Escobar's organization as typical gangsters with gold chains who liked a flashy lifestyle. The Cali traffickers were low-key and manipulative. We called them criminals in Gucci shoes." Back in 1981, the Drug Enforcement Administration opened branches in Cali and Medellin. Working as a DEA agent in Colombia was risky. In 1976, an agent was shot and killed in Bogota. The killer simply walked into the office, went up to the right floor, and put 3 bullets into the agent. The 2 offices were very low-key, with 2 agents in each office to gather information. The main thing they were able to establish was there were a lot of traffickers, and they all cooperated with either Cali or Medellin. But Medellin was outnumbered. The most notorious and high-profile of the bosses was, of course, Chepe Santa Cruz. Agents finally drew up a more or less clear portrait of him, and Colombian authorities authorized the tapping of Chepe's phone calls with the United States. In 1983, Colombian authorities began to do just that. Of course, the bosses were immediately aware of this, because, as we said earlier, they had become concerned about it years earlier when they bribed telephone operators. One of Santa Cruz's lawyers visited the DEA office in Colombia and warned that he planned to seek an order prohibiting police from tapping all of Santa Cruz's phones. By this time, the Cali Cartel had a team of talented lawyers representing their interests in the legal field. By the mid-80s, the Cali Cartel's strategy was finalized. Buy Colombia, not terrorize it. Spread money everywhere and everyone will accept you. Support a political candidate and they're in your pocket. When the drug money flooded into Cali, the cartel triggered an economic boom. Agents investigating the cartel said the good citizens of Cali were willing to look the other way as the Godfathers ingratiated themselves to their favors by spreading their wealth around the city. This later made our task much more difficult when we tried to destroy the cartel. But a cartel is still a cartel, even if it wears Gucci shoes. It's widely known that the city was cleansed of antisocial elements like street gangs and prostitutes, whose bodies were dumped in the Cauca River. By the mid-1980s, the Cali Cartel had corrupted all key sectors of Colombian society. They felt untouchable, and they were untouchable. The authorities were not going to prosecute them. They were too busy going after the rampaging Medellin Cartel. The gentlemen from Cali could now concentrate on turning their organization into a multinational criminal enterprise. Escobar at the time was an alternate delegate to the Colombian Congress. As an outlaw with a passion for being accepted by Colombia's elite class, Escobar envisioned himself as a sports promoter, industrialist, philanthropist, building contractor, and natural resource advocate. But then Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, A principled fighter for the rule of law, determined to pursue the Medellin Cartel to the end, appeared on his trail. As a result of their confrontation, Escobar's sicarios shot him with a submachine gun in a crowded Bogota street. The assassination of the Minister of Justice forced President Belisario Betancourt to declare war without mercy on all drug traffickers, and the Godfathers of the Medellin Cartel performed a disappearing act from public life. The Godfathers of Cali did not approve of Lara Bonilla's murder, but they too were forced to go underground. It was then that Gilberto Rodriguez and his friend Jorge Ochoa left for Spain, while Santa Cruz traveled to Mexico and sent several of his associates to the United States to investigate possible sites for new cocaine labs. Next came the siege of the Colombian Palace of Justice, in which M19 guerrillas took 250 people hostage, including the Chief Justice of the Colombian Supreme Court and many of the 24 Supreme Court justices. Over the next 24 hours, thousands of soldiers and police tried to retake the building, but the heavily armed and well-entrenched guerrillas fought them off. When the government finally prevailed, 25 hostages lay dead, including Chief Justice Alfonso Reyes and apparently all the guerrillas. It's widely believed that the Medellin Cartel paid the guerrillas to take over the palace and burn extradition cases in the court archives that contained compromising evidence against them. The judges, many of whom favored keeping the extradition treaty with the US, were scheduled to vote on the issue in the near future. The shocking attack at the heart of the Colombian legal system set the tone for the rest of the decade. By 1990, more than 200 judicial officials and at least 40 Colombian judges had been assassinated. Colombian President Virgilio Barco Vargas, who took office in 1986, honored an extradition treaty between Colombia and the United States. In response, the Medellin Cartel launched a ruthless terrorist campaign against the state. The cartel vowed better a grave in Colombia than a prison in the United States, and began targeting prominent extradition supporters as well as hardline drug officials. A string of bloody murders ensued. When Gilberto Rodriguez and Jorge Ochoa went to Spain, they had trusted each other and worked together to explore new markets. But relations gradually deteriorated as the two powerful organizations expanded their activities, and tensions grew between them over the different paths chosen for that expansion. A key moment was the extradition of Ochoa and Rodriguez from Spain in 1986. Rodriguez went on trial in Colombia in March 1987 for cocaine smuggling charges that could have led to his extradition to America, but this took place in a town where the Cali Cartel owned everything, including the judicial system, so Rodriguez was predictably acquitted. Jorge Ochoa returned to Colombia in July 1986, facing a more difficult legal situation than his childhood friend, and had to go on the run. We talked about this in more detail in our video on the Medellin Cartel. Ochoa was a fugitive from justice until November 1986, when police stopped him at a checkpoint near Palmira on the outskirts of Cali. He was on his way to a summit meeting called by Escobar to work out the details of a single super cartel to be headed by Escobar. According to the informant, Ochoa arrived in Cali in a white Porsche. When a police officer stopped Ochoa's car, the drug lord nonchalantly offered the officer a $10 bribe, which he refused. The bribe offer grew to $400,000, but to no avail. Ochoa was arrested and placed in a maximum security prison in Bogota. Meanwhile, the US demanded his extradition. Ochoa was, of course, released on December 30th, but the seeds of distrust were sown. The Medellin Godfathers wondered, had their friends in Cali provided the information that led to Ochoa's arrest? And why didn't they try to get him out of jail sooner? Why did they even allow such a thing to happen on their turf? Meanwhile, at that meeting on the super cartel that Jorge Ochoa did not attend, Escobar laid out his proposal. Under his leadership, a unified cartel would coordinate the political and economic strategy of all drug traffickers in Colombia. Moreover, not only would he approve each shipment, but he would receive 30% of the wholesale value for each. 2 or 3 years earlier, such a proposal made by the powerful and ruthless Pablo might have intimidated Cali's Godfathers into agreeing to such an outlandish arrangement. But that was before. Now they were strong enough to categorically reject Escobar's demands and tell the Medellin boss that they wouldn't pay him a dime. According to journalist Simon Strong, nearly at a loss for words from rage, Escobar simply muttered, "But this means war," and immediately left the ranch. In addition to this, several other scenarios have been proposed to explain why their deteriorating relationship escalated into open warfare. One theory, popular in many sources, is that the two groups were engaged in a power struggle in the New York market. They say that Cali had dominated the cocaine market since the mid-1970s, but when the market got oversaturated in the mid-80s and prices began to fall, a more aggressive Medellin group led by Jose Rodriguez Gacha began making its way into the lucrative New York scene. Another theory is that the Colombian government may have been trying to stir up a feud. One report from the U.S. Embassy in Bogota to the U.S. State Department said that General Jaime Ruiz Barrera, commander of the Medellin Army Brigade, and the mayor of Medellin were pushing this line strongly, possibly to turn the cartels against each other. The mutual hatred of Pablo Escobar and Pacho Herrera, stemming from a dispute over an employee of one of Escobar's New York distributors, is another plausible explanation for why the cartels were at each other's throats. While in prison in the early 1980s, Herrera befriended a Colombian named Pina, an employee of Jaime Pabon, who was a big cocaine distributor for Escobar. But Pina angered Pabon when he harassed a member of his family and had to flee and seek support from Herrera's organization. At first, Pacho Herrera refused to hire Pina because he knew that Pabon was a close associate of the powerful and violent Escobar. He did not want to come into conflict with El Patron. However, Pabon was deterred and personally asked Escobar for help. Pablo believed that one call to Chepe Santa Cruz would be enough to force Herrera to give up Pina. The Rodriguez brothers, Pacho Herrera and Santa Cruz, met. They knew the consequences of Pablo's defiance, but decided that maintaining a united front would be the best response to his threats. "We have no quarrel with Pina," was their response to Escobar. A furious Escobar called Pacho and demanded that Pina be extradited within 24 hours or he would kill Herrera's entire family. Instead of being frightened, Herrera took Escobar's demand as an insult to his honor. In the ruthless world of drug trafficking, there are times when honor trumps business. Pacho called his brother Ramon, who ran his cell in New York, and ordered him to hire Pina immediately. Shortly before dawn on January 13, 1988, a huge bomb exploded outside Monaco, a luxurious 8-story apartment building owned by Escobar in the upscale El Poblado neighborhood of Medellin. The drug lord was not home, but his wife, Victoria, their son Juan Pablo, and daughter Manuela were asleep in the penthouse. The explosion killed 2 night watchmen, created a hole 13 feet deep in the street, and blew out the windows of nearby buildings. Remarkably, Escobar's family was not injured, although the blast partially stunned his daughter Manuela. The assassination attempt shocked Escobar. No one had ever challenged his authority before. All he had to do was threaten and intimidate, and it always worked. At first, he thought the DEA was responsible, but then he came to the conclusion that it was rival upstarts from Cali, trying to seize control of his distribution networks. Escobar sent sicarios to Cali to find the enemies and kill them. Believing that the best defense is a good offense, the Godfathers of Cali sent their own combat troops to Medellin. Thus began the war. In mid-August, Colombian military intelligence reported that 60 members of the Cali Cartel and 18 members of the Medellin Cartel had been killed after the Monaco bombing. Both sides realized that the war was bad for the drug business and tried to negotiate a truce, but too much animosity had built up. Instead of seeking peace, the two organizations became increasingly violent. One 200-pound Renault bomb exploded at the La Rebaja drugstore in Cali, killing 7 people, injuring 24 others, destroying a supermarket, and damaging 20 other businesses and 7 homes. The war spread to the United States too, and in the last week of August, the media reported several dozen bombings in New York and Miami. According to the New York Times, law officials said that there was evidence that the two cartels had begun informing police of each other's shipments, and that, as a result of the anonymous reports, police made several large seizures throughout the year. The Cali Cartel also reportedly sent more than a dozen professional assassins to the U.S. from Colombia. Both cartels went even further and hired foreign mercenaries. Yair Klein, a retired Israel Defense Forces colonel and friend of Carlos Leder, helped arrange the delivery of 100 Uzi submachine guns, 460 Galil automatic rifles, and 200,000 rounds of ammunition to Rodriguez Gacha and trained some of his men. Meanwhile, the Cali Cartel enlisted a team of 11 British mercenaries in August 1988 to plan an operation to kill Escobar. The mercenaries trained for 3 months in preparation for an assault on Escobar's ranch, Hacienda Napoles, but the operation turned into a fiasco when a helicopter carrying the assault team crashed into a mountain, ruining the mission. As the war dragged on, the stance of Colombia's security forces increasingly angered Escobar. Escobar believed Gilberto Rodriguez had made a deal with the DEA. From Escobar's perspective, the Colombian government seemed only interested in destroying his cartel, not Cali, and he suspected that the state security forces were in league with his arch-rivals. And as it later turned out, he was right. "We saw Escobar and the Medellin Cartel as the worst of two evils," explained Cesar Gaviria Trujillo, Colombia's president from 1988 to 1992. That's why the Colombian government directed all its attention to resources against the Medellin Cartel. When Escobar became enraged with irrefutable evidence of authorities' cooperation with Cali, Colombia floundered. A series of bombings, the assassination of presidential candidate Luis Carlos Galán, the bombing of an airplane over Bogota, the state launched an all-out war against Medellin, in which all means were a go, including close cooperation with Escobar's rivals, the hated Cali Cartel. Between mid-August and mid-December of 1989, the government arrested 497 people, seized $250 million worth of drugs and property, and extradited 9 suspects to America. During the same period, Escobar retaliated by killing 187 officials and civilians, carrying out 205 bombings, and causing $501 million in damage. The Cali Cartel was not just actively involved in the war, they were essentially directing its course. Their spying and intelligence information, which was sought day and night, was more effective than gang slaughter and terrorist attacks. In early 1989, the cartel leadership hired Jorge Enrique Velázquez, nicknamed El Navegante, to infiltrate Jose Rodriguez Gacha's organization. Velázquez did such a good job that Rodriguez Gacha trusted him completely with his security. The Cali Cartel paid Velázquez $1 million to get the Mexican, Peña recounted. Velázquez led the police right to Rodriguez Gacha. On December 15, 1989, security forces killed Gacha, his son Freddy, and several bodyguards in a shootout, which undoubtedly severely disrupted the structural integrity of the Medellin Cartel and hurt Pablo Escobar. In March 1990, bombs exploded simultaneously in Cali, Bogota, and Medellin, killing 26 people and injuring 200 more. Escobar increased the reward he had previously paid for killing a police officer to $4,000, plus an $8,000 bonus for killing any member of the security forces. In 3 months, 108 police officers were killed. In 1990, President Barco had spent 4 years trying to overthrow Escobar, but the drug lord remained at large and narco-terrorism was still a fact of life in the country. In May of that year, Cesar Gaviria Trujillo won the presidential election. His campaign emphasized a hardline platform that made no concessions to the narcos. Once in power, however, Gaviria dramatically changed his position and began to pursue a policy of compromise rather than confrontation. On August 7th, Gaviria made a generous offer to the drug lords: turn yourselves in and get light sentences and immunity from extradition. Escobar sensed weakness and increased pressure on the government to extract more concessions from Gaviria. In September, he kidnapped journalist Francisco Santos, a member of the family that owned the country's largest newspaper, El Tiempo, and Marina Montoya, the sister of Germán Montoya, a former presidential secretary. Escobar shrewdly concluded that the best way to change government policy was to make the country's elite the primary target of his terrorist campaign. On September 25th, Escobar resumed his two-front war, not forgetting his main enemies. His men attacked an estate near Cali, reputedly owned by the Rodriguez brothers. 18 people were killed and several more wounded. The wave of kidnappings and murders continued until late October. The Cali Cartel at this time regularly sent hitmen into Medellin, with varying degrees of success. On one occasion, 12 men were abducted from their hotel rooms in Medellin. 4 of them were found shot dead, and the other 8 were missing. On the bodies of 2 of the dead were pinned signs that read, "Because they are from Cali Cartel, war is war." Authorities predicted that the cartel war would get even more horrific, and there were increasingly more such episodes. A few weeks after the kidnapping of Francisco Santos and Marina Montoya, Gaviria issued a decree giving further concessions to the drug traffickers. Now all a trafficker had to do when he surrendered was confess to only one crime, and he could avoid extradition if any new charges were brought against him after surrendering. In December, President Gaviria issued another decree offering traffickers full judicial benefits if they confessed to one crime. The Ochoa brothers, Medellin's bosses, were the ones who eventually accepted the government's offer. The deal was too good to pass up. Do a few years in prison with no possibility of extradition to the United States, and you could walk free and still spend your fortune. With Rodriguez Gacha dead and the Ochoas imprisoned, Escobar was left alone in his two-front war. He feared extradition if he surrendered. Nothing guaranteed that he would get the same concessions as Ochoa. After all, he didn't stop killing and kidnapping after Gaviria issued his decrees. He continued to fight the state the only way he could: narco-terrorism. In January, Marina Montoya's body was found in Bogota with 6 bullets in her head. During a raid near Medellin, police accidentally killed another of Escobar's kidnapped victims, Diana Turbay, scion of another prominent Colombian family and daughter of a former presidential candidate. Gaviria sensed that Colombians were tired of living under the tyranny of narco-terrorism, and he pursued a policy of surrender, which he sweetened and offered to traffickers. He issued a new decree guaranteeing immunity from extradition for all crimes, not just from the time of the first decree. Meanwhile, in early 1991, as part of an effort to reform the country's constitution, the Constituent Assembly debated the extradition policy, considering banning it altogether. Since 1984, the extradition treaty had been the subject of heated debate, and while the países had often been merely intimidating, Cali had always acted in its gentlemanly style. The Cali Cartel paid many in parliament, and its lawyers were always hanging around during the extradition debate, one deputy recounted. In late May, Escobar announced that he would surrender in exchange for a promise from President Gaviria that he would be treated leniently and not extradited to America, where he faced at least a dozen drug trafficking and murder charges. Now the drug lord had everything he wanted. It was time to turn himself in and join the Ochoas in prison. On June 19, 1991, the most wanted man in Colombia, and possibly the world, was picked up from an undisclosed location and flown by plane to his hometown of Envigado, where he was locked in a luxury prison called La Catedral, specially built for him. While Escobar had been at war with the state, the Cali Cartel continued to build power, wealth, and influence, consolidating its base in the United States and expanding into Europe and throughout Latin America. By 1990, U.S. officials who months earlier had claimed that the Medellin Cartel was responsible for most of the cocaine smuggled into the country now discovered that the Cali Syndicate had captured the lion's share of the traffic. By the end of 1990, Cali's shares of the U.S. market had jumped to about 70% plus 95% of European distribution. But the larger the organization, the more it stood out. On July 1, 1991, Gilberto Rodriguez gave an interview to Time magazine in which he portrayed himself as an honest businessman and an innocent target of the psychopath Escobar. He denied his involvement in the drug trade. He blamed the conflict on Escobar's tendency to see anyone who didn't support him as an enemy. This all started when Mr. Escobar called me and asked me to help him commit violent acts to get the Colombian government to annul a 1979 extradition treaty. Mr. Escobar believes that it's necessary to take justice into his own hands. I disagree. He thinks a criminal can win a war against the state. I think that's absurd. The crimes he committed in Colombia under the pretext of drug trafficking were a very big mistake, Gilberto Rodriguez told Time magazine. Rodriguez called the Cali Cartel a fabrication of General Jaime Ruiz, who unsuccessfully prosecuted Escobar and his partners. He, Rodriguez said, failed to make history with the Medellin Cartel, so he invented a war for the New York markets and assigned me, an honest businessman, to it. He also said that he was still worried about his safety because, like all Colombians, he realized that Pablo was unlikely to stay in prison and pay his debt to society. He did not tell Gilberto, of course, about the main thing. The Cali Cartel was not going to stop either. At that time, many of Pablo's former associates began turning to Cali for help, including the Castaño brothers, his enforcers. Due to Pablo's escalating paranoia, he began a reprisal against anyone he deemed a traitor. In the months that followed, mutilated corpses began to pop up around La Catedral, including some of Escobar's most trusted aides. The victims were rumored to have been kidnapped and taken to prison, where they were tortured and murdered under Escobar's supervision. In July 1993, Escobar escaped even though 500 soldiers surrounded the prison. He first escaped to a ranch, La Romelia, and waited in hiding until the first search patrols left the area and the clamor over his escape subsided. Escobar then moved to Llano Grande, near Rio Negro, again embarrassing the state. Gaviria knew he had to get the drug lord back, or he would have to forget his place of honor in Colombian history. Escobar had it much harder this time. He wasn't just at war with the government. Everyone, including former allies, had turned against him. And he also had to worry about his godfathers in Cali, because he knew they wouldn't sleep well until they removed their nemesis from the scene. On January 30th, 1993, a bomb exploded in downtown Bogota, killing 20 people. Public enemy number 1 had left a message for the nation. But then came the surprise. The next day, 2 bombs, one containing over 200 pounds of dynamite, and the other over 170 pounds, exploded in Medellin in front of apartment buildings where Escobar's wife, 2 children, his sisters, and mother-in-law lived. At the same time, 5 armed men showed up at the empty country home of Escobar's mother, 28 miles from Medellin, ordered the lone caretaker to leave, and blew up the building. In a statement issued on February 2nd, a new group, Los Pepes, suddenly claimed responsibility for the attacks. Los Pepes yearned for the total destruction of Pablo Escobar, his followers, and his assets to give him a taste of the medicine he unjustly hands out to so many. Los Pepes, aka those prosecuted by Pablo Escobar, essentially started a war with Escobar by his own rules. You might say Pablo created the group himself. When he was in La Catedral, the business was run by 2 of his confidants, Fernando Galeano and Gerardo Kiko Moncada, 2 men who were completely loyal to the Medellin Cartel and had proven it time and time again. Pablo, in a fit of paranoia, summoned them to his room, tortured them at length, and killed them. Moncada's wife, wanting revenge, began to look for options, and the most obvious was to unite with their worst enemies. But she was not the only one displeased with the actions of former El Patron. The murder of his closest associates and loyal drug tradesmen made others begin to worry for their own skin. As soon as Escobar killed Galeano and Moncada, their people felt threatened, ran to the Cali Cartel, and said, "We want to switch sides," explained Joe Toft, head of the DEA in Bogota at the time. The Cali bosses said, "Okay, if you want to come to the other side, you're going to have to pay us." A lot of money then flowed from Medellin to Cali. At first, however, the gentlemen from Cali refused to participate in such dubious endeavors as collaborating with Los Pepes, but then changed their minds when they realized the benefits of such a move. In addition, Los Pepes had Escobar's former enforcers, and DEA agents were secretly cooperating with them. There was talk of CIA involvement. That is, in fact, Los Pepes were a group of former Escobar supporters who began to fight against him under the auspices of the Cali Cartel. The core of Los Pepes were the Cali bosses who provided the funding, as well as Escobar's former associates, the Castaño brothers, Carlos and Fidel, and Don Berna. The Castaños were portrayed in the Narcos series as 2 savage psychopathic killers, but it omits the fact that both of these psychopaths were longtime members of the Medellin Cartel and led the Los Tangueros death squad. Don Berna is the most important character in the history of Los Pepes, and he's worth talking about more. He began his career with Medellin as a simple enforcer and through hard work rose up the hierarchy to become the head of security for the very Fernando Galeano, who was killed by Escobar. After his death, Berna saw the chance not only to avenge his boss, but also to advance his career. He was the one who negotiated funding deals with Cali, and he was the one who served as the liaison between politicians and Los Pepes as represented by the Castaños and the Cali bosses. Don Berna's bureaucratic connections were truly staggering. As Agent Chris Feistel said years later, Berna was one of the main liaisons that went between Los Pepes, the police force, and the Drug Enforcement Administration to provide information. Police were represented by the Search Bloc, formed in 1989, the real elites of Colombian law enforcement, who by default had a direct link to the president. The bloc was commanded by 25 officers, one of whom was intelligence officer Danilo Gonzalez. It was he who was tasked with collaborating with Don Berna, and the two eventually became friends, although Gonzalez had been seen befriending suspicious individuals before. His buddies included 2 corrupt Cali cops who, after the fall of the Cali Cartel in 1995, would join the Norte de Valle Cartel, the largest organization for the next 10 years. Danilo Gonzalez himself would form a group called the Devil's Cartel. After the fall of Cali, Don Berna would become Colombia's most important crime boss until 2005, thanks to the connections built up during Los Pepes' tenure. Los Pepes proved to be an ideal criminal structure in terms of organization, where there was a literal fusion of corrupt authorities, law enforcement agencies, and organized crime that worked together and thrived until 2005. By the way, if you're interested to see about the Norte de Valle Cartel, Don Berna, and the unification of Colombian criminals after the fall of Medellin and Cali, write about it in the comments. So it's unlikely that members of the political elite came to the Cali Cartel to ask for help themselves, as was shown in the Narcos series. All interests converged at one point, Los Pepes, which was run by Don Berna and the Castaño brothers. Los Pepes, the DEA, the police search block, the CIA, the political elites, and the Cali Cartel were closely intertwined, united by one goal: stop Escobar at any cost. An enraged Escobar immediately struck back. On the morning of February 15th, two powerful bombs exploded 5 minutes and 12 blocks apart in central Bogota, killing 4 people and injuring more than 100. These were the 5th and 6th car bombs since Escobar had declared war on the state in mid-January. But a few hours later in Medellin, unknown assailants driving in a blue Toyota camper set fire to a luxury home owned by Escobar in the exclusive El Poblado. It was the Pepes again, showing that they meant exactly what they said, a tooth for tooth every time Escobar committed an act of terror. 2 days later, the gunman killed Carlos Maria Ossa, Escobar's top financer, who had helped fund Pablo's terrorist campaign. On the same day, Carlos Ossate, Escobar's enforcer who could not reach Pablo without Ossa, surrendered. Los Pepes began to undermine Escobar's organization in earnest. The Cali Cartel had state-of-the-art computer systems and top experts who were proactive in researching Escobar's infrastructure. In addition, they were not bound by the framework of the law, but had tacit carte blanche from the state and the DEA, which greatly accelerated the process. On March 5th, however, Los Pepes announced a ceasefire without explaining the reasons, although the press speculated that it was to give Escobar time to surrender. This did not happen, and exactly 1 month later, they issued another proclamation, declaring their commitment to the total destruction of Escobar. In other words, the Pepes were saying, "We're going to get you, Pablo, no matter what you do." By mid-November, they had killed 50 of Escobar's men, including his son-in-law, and destroyed about 20 properties owned by his relatives and associates. The vigilantes failed to catch the big fish, but they slowly poisoned the sea in which he swam. They also embarrassed the Colombian government. Why hasn't the Gaviria administration taken control of the situation? Colombians wondered. Or were Los Pepes and the government working together? At the time, Los Pepes began their campaign against Escobar. U.S. and Colombian officials, of course, publicly denied that Cali Cartel had provided them with information that helped in the hunt for Escobar. Today, however, these officials readily admit that the Cali men did play a key role in bringing Pablo down. The Colombian government was engaged in a deadly struggle against Pablo, and it didn't care where the information came from as long as it was accurate. Colombia's nightmare ended on December 2nd, 1993, when Escobar was murdered on the roof of a house in Medellin. When Cali's radio stations broadcast the news of Escobar's death, residents celebrated by lining up caravans of honking cars and waving white flags outside Rodriguez's pharmacies. Miguel, having learned of Escobar's death from a spy from upstairs, immediately called Gilberto, and during the conversation, the latter cried. Later, he hugged his terrified accountant, Guillermo Payomari. This uncharacteristic gesture by the usually assertive and formal Godfather startled the accountant and showed the strain the Cali men had been under in the war with Escobar. The Godfathers of Cali were relieved that their nemesis was finally buried in the grave, but they were now the new kings of cocaine, and the government immediately announced that it would now go after Cali as well. It should be noted that despite the hunt for Escobar, authorities had also been trying to infiltrate Cali's infrastructure all those years. They conducted a series of raids on drug laboratories, official residences, and office buildings belonging to the Godfathers, destroying nearly 20 tons of processed cocaine and 100 labs. In January 1992, Colombian security forces executed an operation against the cartel's money laundering schemes, conducting 32 simultaneous raids, not only in Cali, but also in Bogota and Barranquilla. They confiscated numerous computers, floppy disks, and 20,000 other financial records and uncovered information that led to 3 arrests and the freezing of $15 million in bank accounts in Colombia, Britain, Germany, Hong Kong, and the United States. In late December 1993, 120 U.S. Army engineers arrived in Colombia for a 10-week construction project in the jungle village of Huanchaco, about 75 miles from Cali. Officials in both countries insisted that the troops were there solely to build schools and roads, but many Cali residents believed that the true purpose of the project was to build a major base for gathering intelligence and organizing raids on the cartel's infrastructure. Meanwhile, the cartel was exploring options post-Escobar. Its leaders held an important meeting to discuss their future and how they could increase drug trafficking into America and go international. The cartel had big dreams and plans, but their own nightmare was already starting to materialize. With Escobar finally out of the picture, taking down Cali became the primary goal of U.S. law enforcement. A massive breakthrough occurred on May 18, 1994, when Colombian authorities confiscated an IBM AS-400 computer worth the tidy sum of $1 million from a high-ranking associate of the Rodriguez brothers. To date, the supercomputer is the most sophisticated technology ever seized from drug traders. It took the DEA months before its computer experts were able to crack it. What they discovered was staggering. Computer files containing information on thousands of bribes paid by the cartel to Colombians from all walks of life. By 1995, the Colombian government had deployed 500 soldiers and police officers in the search block unit to track down and eliminate the Rodriguez brothers and their key subordinates. Authorities conducted a series of raids and scattered hundreds of leaflets around Cali, announcing a $1.6 million reward for information leading to the capture of Gilberto and Miguel. But nothing happened. Search block would show up at a house, apartment, or business, only to learn that one of the brothers had just escaped. Corruption was still rampant, and the government had to fire 174 police officers, including 48 captains and other high-ranking officers linked to the Cali Cartel. Colombian authorities, backed by U.S. authorities, persevered with the investigation. Most cartel operatives were deathly afraid to snitch against the powerful bosses, but eventually a couple of their associates did, and it proved to be another major breakthrough for them. The first to be approached was Harold Ackerman, who was such an important cellhead that he was called the Cali Cartel's ambassador to the United States. He was an exemplary Cali manager and employee who helped make the cartel the most powerful and successful criminal corporation in the world. Ackerman owned a clothing store in Miami. "I was living a good life, but one day Colombians started coming into my store," Ackerman recalled. "They told me I could make a lot more money with the Cali Cartel." Ackerman estimated he made $3 million in 2 years of business from 1991. In April 1993, he was arrested, and through one of his lawyers, Miguel Rodriguez gave him a message. "Don't worry, Harold. Don't take it personally. Your family will receive a monthly payment." The second part of the message read, "Mr. Rodriguez reminds you that as a friend, he is a very good man, but as an enemy, he will be very bad. You think about the deal and not even your dog will be left. Remember, you still have family in Colombia." Despite this, Ackerman went along with the deal. He became one of the most important witnesses ever to testify against the Cali Cartel, and his testimony helped make Operation Cornerstone one of the most significant criminal investigations in U.S. history. Ackerman explained in detail the organization's hierarchy, its structure, its methods of operation, and the routes used to import and distribute cocaine into the United States. As a result of this information, a number of investigations and operations were launched against the cartel. Miguel Rodriguez took the news of Ackerman's betrayal hard. All their plans to take over the world market had fallen apart. Now they needed a lot of money to keep their giant transnational crime organization afloat. But the arrest of Ackerman and other associates was draining the flow of money and disrupting distribution. The second important Cali partner to seek American help was Guillermo Payomari, the cartel's chief accountant. By the summer of '95, Payomari had become a man who knew too much, as he attended most of the cartel's important meetings and kept track of hundreds of documents. In April 1995, the Colombian government accused him of being a frontman for the criminal enterprise and summoned him for questioning. Miguel Rodriguez thought Payomari would break and knew time was short. If the police caught Payomari, he would be a formidable witness against him. Miguel made a contract to kill his former accountant, but Payomari managed to go underground in Cali. He realized that his only chance of staying alive was to turn himself in, so he called the U.S. Embassy in Bogota to make arrangements. In August, Payomari arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Bogota and met with the DEA to negotiate the details of surrender and cooperation. In exchange for his testimony, he joined the Witness Protection Program. His wife was supposed to meet with him the day he left for Bogota, but never showed up at the designated location. She went missing. At the same time, deep emotions were simmering in Colombian politics. Attorney General Gustavo de Greve was pushing a policy of legalization and the idea of integrating the Cali Cartel drug business in a peaceful way. In Colombia, the Attorney General's office is a branch of the judiciary and is completely independent of the president. In short, Colombia's president has no control over the country's chief prosecutor, and incumbent President Gaviria was unhappy with the prosecutor's actions but could do nothing. But more displeased with Gaviria, the U.S. authorities, who were in no way happy with this soft policy toward Cali. But de Graef continued to go his own way in solving the problem. He wanted to convince the leaders to surrender, believing that this was the best way to reduce or eliminate the massive corruption and widespread violence associated with the cartels. So he came up with a submission to justice plan that he hoped would induce the Godfathers to abandon their criminal ways. The plan included the following conditions. When the Attorney General's office received evidence, the drug trafficker would be offered a reduced sentence. A drug dealer who the agency had evidence against but not enough would receive half the maximum sentence. So, of course, no extradition. U.S. government officials had reason to suspect that there was more to de Graef's relationship with the Cali Cartel than met the eye. De Graef's name appeared along with Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela's in airline records, indicating that they were both co-workers. The Attorney General denied that he had ever met Gilberto or Miguel Rodriguez, but during the investigation, cartel accountant Bayomare testified that de Graef met with the brothers twice in 1993 to discuss the surrender deal and possibly the Los Pepes cases. The situation was dragging on. The bosses were still untouchable to the U.S., and moreover, the possibility of legalization loomed on the horizon. In the run-up to the election, Cali sponsored a candidate, Ernesto Samper, who had long-standing ties to the vendors. At least in 1981, he had met with all Medellin at the Hotel Intercontinental, and in a notebook Gilberto Rodriguez had taken in Spain, Samper's personal number was found. Everything should have been resolved in the best possible way, if not for the drug tape scandal that broke. On June 5, 1994, during Colombia's presidential election, presidential candidate Andres Pastrana was campaigning in Cali. An unidentified man handed him several cassettes containing unusual conversations obtained through phone tapping. The tapes provided Pastrana with irrefutable evidence that the Cali Cartel had financed his opponent Ernesto Samper's campaign to the tune of more than $6 million. The tapes, however, had no effect on the outcome of the election, and Ernesto Samper still won. However, he had to prove that it was not because of the Cali Cartel's infusions. It was a paradoxical situation. A president allegedly compromised by drugs became a reliable and predictable ally of Washington in the war on drugs. The man who the Cali bosses were banking on became their worst enemy. As the prime suspect in shady deals with drug lords, Samper could not defy the Clinton administration when the Americans began to press him to go after the drug lords. The constant pressure and raids began to have some impact on the cartel's communications network and cash flow. Given the $1.9 million reward for Miguel and Gilberto Rodriguez and $625,000 for Santa Cruz and Herrera, the Godfathers had to constantly worry about informants and betrayal. The supposedly kinder and gentler cartel was not about to take any chances. In 6 weeks, some 75 corpses were discovered in the city, some bearing signs of torture. The first to be tracked down was Gilberto. Through his associate nicknamed Flaco, informants said that if Flaco was found, sooner or later the boss would show up. On June 9, 1995, Gilberto Rodriguez Orejuela was found in an upscale apartment in Cali. When authorities made the arrest, the terrified chess player exclaimed, "Don't shoot, I'm a man of peace." By arresting Gilberto Rodriguez, Colombia and the U.S. won their first major victory over the Cali Cartel. Rodriguez was facing up to 24 years in prison on drug trafficking and illicit enrichment charges and had several indictments filed against him in various U.S. cities. However, if his attorneys could obtain for him the full benefits of the Colombian Penal Code, he faced no more than 5 years. The day after his arrest, a bomb exploded during a street festival in San Antonio Park in central Medellin, killing 21 people and injuring more than 200. An anonymous caller reported that the bombing was in retaliation for Rodriguez's arrest. However, terrorist attacks could no longer distract the Colombian authorities, who had focused their attention on Miguel Rodriguez. Catching the cunning and ever-ready Miguel was helped by a security chief named Jorge Salcedo. Ironically, a few years before, Rodriguez himself had also managed to track down Gacha. Salcedo, at incredible cost and deadly risk, provided the DEA with accurate information about Miguel's hideout, who had pretty much figured out who the mole in his organization was. For 4 days, agents kept surveillance on the apartment in an upscale complex that Salcedo had pointed out. When they were satisfied that Miguel was indeed there, they scheduled the raid for August 6th, just the next day. All previous attempts to catch Miguel had been unsuccessful. Each time he had managed to get a half step ahead of the agents, and time was playing against them. The success of the operation depended on the element of surprise. Rodriguez always had several escape routes, thanks to which he often avoided capture. This time, the agents caught him just as he was trying to go into a hiding place behind a 5-door filing cabinet built into the wall. It had all the comforts of home: food, bottled water, an oxygen tank for breathing, a stool, and a copy of the Colombian Penal Code. When he spotted a gringo in the crowd after his arrest, he understood everything and seemed resigned to his fate. He even calmly took pictures with DEA agents. Chepe Santa Cruz was dead by then. He had been arrested a little before Miguel and put in Lakota prison, where he had successfully escaped in a clever way. A car with supposed investigators came to him. They were let through and took Chepe to freedom. Military and intelligence units scoured Cali and Bogota, but found no indication of his whereabouts. The Colombian government offered a $2 million reward for Chepe's return. What happened next is still unclear. According to the official version, Santa Cruz was killed in a shootout with police on August 5, 1996. This was confirmed by DEA agents. However, post-mortem photographs show that Chepe's body bore signs of torture. Santa Cruz's family demanded a second autopsy, but Chepe was buried in Cali Cemetery without it. Today, many sources remain skeptical of this official version, and it's likely that Danilo Gonzalez and Don Berna were involved in Santa Cruz's death and had a hand in eliminating their rival, anticipating the imminent fall of the giant. After Santa Cruz's death, Pacho Herrera became Cali's only remaining godfather. On September 1, 1996, after months of negotiations, Pacho arrived at the Cali police base to surrender directly to General Serrano. Herrera became an informant, accusing 35 people, including some of his family members, of membership in the cartel. In return, Herrera received a sentence of 6 years and 8 months and a $1 million fine for the drug trafficking offense. On November 5, 1998, Pacho was playing football in the maximum security area of the Palmira prison when a well-dressed man posing as a lawyer approached him, warmly embraced him, and then pulled out a gun and shot him 6 times in the head. The Cali Cartel was decapitated. Still, Miguel and Gilberto lived in La Picota prison, more like guests than criminals, thanks to Colombia's incorrigibly corrupt prison system. The brothers used mobile phones and presumably a communications network running through a payphone in the prison to control their business interests. The brothers' families and attorneys came and went as they pleased, delivering their message to and from the prison. In 1 week, 123 lawyers visited Gilberto. Their jail cells were more like upscale apartments and had cable TV, expensive stereos, carpeting, and adjoining private bathrooms. They had their own cook and private bar. In prison, Miguel ran a small kiosk called Poor Miguel's Store, which sold sand tart cookies, aspirin, Côte d'Or chocolates from Belgium, and soft drinks to visitors. For doing business within prison walls, Miguel's sentence could have been reduced by 1/3 under Colombian law. In January 1997, Gilberto and Miguel were finally convicted of their crimes. As a result of a plea bargain negotiated by their lawyers, the older brother received 10.5 years and the younger brother 9. The sentences were a far cry from the maximum 24 years the court could have imposed, or the life without parole they would surely have received if they had been extradited to America. However, this was only the first criminal case against the brothers. There were 4 others pending. The following month, Miguel was sentenced to 23 years behind bars for a 180-kilogram shipment of cocaine to Tampa in 1989, for which he refused to accept responsibility. In May 1998, the appellate court judge added 5 years to Gilberto and Miguel's prison sentences. On November 7, 2002, a Colombian court shocked the nation by deciding to release Gilberto Rodriguez from prison early, despite intense pressure from President Alvaro Uribe. Incredibly, the chess player had spent less than 6 years in prison for his crimes. Then, 4 months after Gilberto's release, the Colombian government brought new charges against him. His alleged involvement in sending 150 kilos of cocaine in 1990 from Colombia to the United States. Gilberto Rodriguez found himself back in the pen. The U.S. government, on the other hand, continued to investigate the Rodriguez Orejuela brothers in order to secure their extradition to the States. It never relented in its aggressive pursuit of Cali Cartel money and assets. The use of economic sanctions against the cartel's assets had become its punitive tool. The Cali Cartel invested billions of dollars earned from the drug trade in companies that looked legitimate, especially pharmaceutical ones. The greatest humiliation for Gilberto and Miguel was the siege of their brainchild, the La Rebaja chain of 400 pharmacies in 26 cities across the country, totaling a worth of $216 million in 2004. It was this seizure that broke the spine of their entire financial organization. On December 3, 2004, Gilberto was extradited to the United States. In March 2005, President Uribe finally ordered Miguel's extradition, and in January 2006, William Rodriguez Abadia, Miguel's son and the de facto head of the Cali Cartel, surrendered to U.S. agents in Panama after years on the run. Then came the real sensation. While his father and uncle languished in Miami's federal detention center awaiting a September trial, Abadia, 40 years old, agreed to testify against them. He also pleaded guilty to whatever prosecutors called his participation in a large-scale cocaine importation conspiracy that existed from 1990 through July 2002, and was sentenced to nearly 22 years in federal prison. He admitted to helping his father and uncle run their criminal empire from behind prison bars after they were incarcerated in 1995, and agreed to give up his stake in a business empire worth about $300 million USD. On September 26th, Gilberto and Miguel, for the sake of ensuring their family members on the so-called Clinton list in the Cali Cartel case could live in peace, pleaded guilty to conspiracy to smuggle more than 200 kilos of coke into the United States from Colombia via Central America. They also agreed to plead guilty to charges by the Southern District of New York for conspiring to launder their illicit fortune through their pharmaceutical empire, which included more than 400 retail pharmacies throughout Colombia, as well as pharmaceutical companies that manufactured drugs. Family members also agreed to relinquish all inheritance from the Rodriguez's businesses in the U.S. and around the world because the investigation found that they had used drug assets. In exchange, the family members received the right to be removed from the blacklist for crimes committed before December 16, 1997. Immediately following the guilty pleas, the judge sentenced Gilberto, 67, and Miguel, 62, to 30 years behind bars on money laundering charges. The sentence would run concurrently with another sentence of 30 years, previously imposed due to cocaine trafficking charges under the Southern District of Florida indictment. Gilberto died in 2022 of cancer at the age of 83. Miguel is still alive today with a release date of July 15, 2028. He is now 80 years old. William Rodriguez, under the terms of the deal, served 5 years and got out. In 2014, he wrote a book titled Son of the Cali Cartel, in which he details his life and why he made the decision to turn in his father and uncle. The defeat of two major Colombian cartels did little to change the war on drugs, but their arrests served as a wise lesson to other drug traffickers in Colombia. If you become too big and complex an organization, you'll be more vulnerable. Today, we can see a radically different type of drug trade organization. Gone are the huge corporations that employed thousands and generated annual revenues of $7 billion. Instead, there are so-called cartelitos that operate as stealthily as the Cali Association did, but they no longer rely on complex structures and modern communication systems. After all, there's nothing more reliable than a face-to-face meeting without unnecessary witnesses. Also, modern Colombian cartels don't sell directly to customers. They sell to Mexicans, so the United States won't be able to bring extradition cases against them, no matter where the coke ends up. Extradition is still the most feared word among narcos. Colombian drug traffickers were once responsible for 80 to 90% of the cocaine trafficked into the United States. With the elimination of Cali and Medellin, Mexican cartels filled much of the vacuum. It is impossible to stop every person and vehicle crossing the border, at least for the 48 million pedestrians, 90 million vehicles, and 4.4 million trucks that the U.S. Border Patrol estimates cross the border each year. Nothing has changed in the never-ending war on drugs, except for the players involved.